Hello. Today's lecture will be divided actually into two parts. They are both on chapter 2 of your text. And I've divided them, I guess, for my mental health, because it's just very hard to concentrate without any interaction or any questions or anything to alter my performance. I find that very difficult, and I'm learning as I go here. But I divided it into two for that reason, and also for you. But of course, you can turn your playback off anytime and come back or look at things again, or however you want to do it. What works best for you, of course, and that's why I'm recording it, so that you have the opportunity to see it again if you need to, and to review things. Go at your own pace. All right, so the first part is slides number 1 through 13. The second is slides number 14 through 26. And then there are 10 slides of quiz questions. That's not graded. It's just for your practice, and they're intended to be questions like what will be on the real quizzes and what will be on the examinations. The quality is the same. They may even be repeated somewhat, but probably I'm going to mostly make up new questions when it comes to the real quiz, but they should be like these. And you won't know the answers unless you figure it out, which quite likely you will figure it out by yourself by studying. But we will start the actual live session during from 4 to 6:45 on Wednesday by reviewing the quiz for each chapter, and answering any questions you have, going in deeper as we need to, and then addressing other questions that don't happen to be on the quiz. And then, of course, I will also have some problems for you to solve, usually in small groups, maybe in the larger group, for us to do live, so that you really learn how to not only have the knowledge and the information, but to apply it. That's really where we're going with the course, is the application of foundational knowledge about neurology. All right, that said, let me share a screen here and go here and find that slide and enlarge it. And there we are. There's just the name of the chapter, Organization of the Nervous System 1, Chapter 2. The chapter is sort of just an overview of everything. I mean, it's got, in a sense, it seems sort of disorganized to me, but I'm not saying I could organize it any better. I think they're just trying to get us through the basics of the neurological system, so that we've got some language to use as we go around and look in more detail at the various different parts, and of course related to speech, language, cognition, and swallowing. So this first slide is, you will find it in your book. It's figure 2.4, and I've done that. I've labeled them all like that, so you can find a good correspondence between the lecture and the textbook. There will be one or two occasionally that aren't from the textbook, and they won't have a figure number, but that's going to be kind of rare. Excuse me. Anyway, this first slide just shows that the organization of the central nervous system, CNS stands for central nervous system, is that there are two main parts, the brain and the spinal cord. They are both parts of the central nervous system, and there is no other part of the central nervous system. So that is it. It's brain and a spinal cord. And the brain is housed inside of the cranium. The cranium is another word, a more technically correct medical type or scientific type of word for the skull. Cranium is a skull, but we'll mostly use the word cranium. And this figure shows, as part of the brain, the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they connect the brain with what they're referring here to as effector organs. Now, those would be either glands or muscles. They're structures or organs that do something, that have an action. And of course, we'll go into a lot of detail on some of those, more than others, that have to do with speech, especially speech and swallowing. And then they also do connect to sensory areas. For example, if you touch your face, the information about the location and the nature of that touch is carried back to the brain for processing, and it's carried by a cranial nerve. And you'll learn exactly what cranial nerve, you'll learn a lot of detail about the cranial nerves. The other part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord, and that part is housed within the column of vertebrae. The column of vertebrae, which is you're basically, I guess you could call them your backbones. There are a bunch of them. You learned the number in your head and neck anatomy course. And there's not an exact numeric correspondence between the number of spinal nerves, which are 31 pairs, it says here, and the number of vertebrae, although it's very close. It's because, you have either 2 or 3 coccygeal bones, which get fused together as one, and that differs from person to person. But it's a close correspondence. And they connect the spinal cord to effector organs and sensory zones as well, but for the rest of the body, not for the head and the face and the throat area. Both spinal nerves and cranial nerves are not part of the central nervous system. They're part of the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, but they're shown here, and so I introduced them on the slide. So you now know that the CNS has a brain and a spinal cord that make it up, and they connect to effector organs. Both of them connect to effector organs or sensory zones by way of nerves, spinal nerves for most of the body, and cranial nerves for the head, neck, throat, that area. All right, going on. Now we're going to look at major parts of the brain in the next several slides. We'll get to spinal cord later. The major parts of the brain include the cerebrum, also called cerebral hemispheres. Here it's labeled the cerebrum. And if you just look at the side of the brain, that's mostly what you see. It's a huge part of the brain. I don't remember the exact percentage, but I would say it's about 80% of the weight of the brain would be the cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres. You have 2 of them. 1 cerebrum, 2 cerebral hemispheres. Also, part of the brain is the diencephalon, and that's going a little deep to the cerebrum. It connects actually the brainstem, which is a part of the brain, with the cerebrum. The diencephalon does, and that consists mostly of the thalamus, although we'll look in a little more detail at that in this series. And then the brainstem connects the cerebrum and the diencephalon with basically the rest of the body, whether it is the head and the face or the rest of the body. So there's a lot of pathways, and there are also some structures within the brainstem that actually process information. They don't just simply carry it, but they process it. We'll look at that. But right now we just want the labels. The midbrain, also called the mesencephalon. I'll say something about these terminologies, mesencephalon, metacephalon, and myelencephalon in a moment, but the midbrain is the same thing as the mesencephalon. The pons is the next segment of the brainstem going downward, and then the medulla is the final segment of the brainstem. And if you go down below the medulla, you're actually out of the cranium and into the spinal cord. Those are referred to as the myelencephalon. The medulla is myelencephalon, same thing. Pons is, if you include the cerebellum, which is this part of the brain that does our coordinating of movements, that's referred to as the metencephalon. So midbrain is same as the mesencephalon. Pons is part of the metencephalon. It includes also the cerebellum, the metencephalon does, and then medulla is same as the myelencephalon. Now, I want to just say this about those terms. We will use them occasionally just like this because you'll see them in the literature. You'll see them in illustrations. Writers and authors and neuroscience types use those terms a lot. But where they come from is actually from embryology. When the embryo first develops a brain, it gets divided into 5 segments. The myelencephalon, going from the bottom, myelencephalon, here we go, metencephalon, mesencephalon, diencephalon, and then this is referred to as the telencephalon. So I'm sorry about that long-winded explanation, but we will occasionally be using those terms because the illustrations we refer to do as well. So you just kind of know the synonyms here for them. What a diencephalon is the same thing as basically mostly the thalamus, etc. Okay, now looking into a little more detail at those parts of the brain that were just brought up, let's look at the diencephalon. It contains connections between the cerebrum or cerebral hemispheres and the rest of the central nervous system, mostly by way of this structure, which I've been sort of emphasizing, the thalamus. Here it is. So you can see the cerebral hemisphere here, the thalamus, and then the other two parts of the diencephalon, the hypothalamus, which we'll look at in a moment, and the epithalamus, which will hardly ever, I don't think I'm going to refer to it again for the course except for right here. All right. Now, this is a certain kind of view of a thalamus in which the brain has been actually cut in a way that separates the front part of the brain from the back. So that's referred to as a coronal view. And I think you know that kind of referred to back to chapter 1 for that, and it's not completely new information. But this section, this coronal section, will show the relationship between the thalamus and some closely positioned structures. And again, I just want to emphasize that the thalamus integrates sensation. It receives every kind of sensory information from your entire body and head, except for olfaction, your sense of smell. It bypasses the thalamus and goes to an older part of the cerebrum. So anyway, it's largely, it's sensory in nature, and it processes the information. Obviously, it does something important, and we'll get to part of what that seems to be later. It has all modalities except olfaction. There are many connections with the cortex from the receptors in the thalamus. In other words, you go from receptors, touch areas, to the thalamus, and then up to the cortex. There are two sides to it. Here's one side. It hasn't labeled it here, but here's the other side. Here would be the midline, separating right from left. The hypothalamus, which we see down here below, is smaller, and it regulates autonomic and endocrine functions. That has to do with the functioning of sort of the chemical functioning of the body, let's say. And the epithalamus, do we see it here? Actually, we don't, but it's a very small, and it modulates circadian rhythms. The subthalamus may inhibit motor pathways. And where do we see that? Do we see that here? No. Okay, I'm sorry. And this is a coronal section, again, really reminding you that, showing the thalamus, internal capsule, and basal ganglia. Now we're going to get to the basal ganglia, but I just for the sake of showing the relationship in space between the thalamus and the basal ganglia, here are two important parts of the basal ganglia, right here. And then there's this area, which is the internal capsule, referred to as the internal capsule. And we're going to look at a lot of detail at the internal capsule. So for right now, it's just fine to know thalamus, internal capsule, basal ganglia, very close and down at the kind of the core of the brain. All right. Oops, excuse me for all that jumping around. All right, here we go. All right, now we're going to the basal ganglia. Now here's another coronal view, but this coronal view is out in front of the previous one, so you don't see the thalamus. It shows a hypothalamus, but it doesn't show a thalamus. It shows the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia consists of the caudate nucleus, here we see it, caudate nucleus, putamen here, globus pallidus here, substantia nigra. Where is our substantia nigra? Do I not see it here? don't see it here. It's not shown here because the coronal section is not quite in the right spot. Sorry. And subthalamic nuclei also, we don't see those here. It's located, these basal ganglia are located deep in the cerebrum. They are part of the cerebral hemispheres, but they're way down deep in it. You can see out here, if you just look at the side of the brain, there's a cortex. And then there's a connecting tissue, connecting neurons that connect different parts of the cortex or connect down below to the body. And then there are basal ganglia, and they're very deep. All right, impairments in the basal ganglia involve, first of all, movement, problems with movement. And those fall into one of two categories, either hypokinesia, in which the body has kind of a stiffness to it and people have difficulty overcoming that stiffness to move. The most frequent, and it's very frequent, disease involving the basal ganglia and hypokinesia is Parkinson's disease. We'll look at the details of it later, but right now just link it up to the basal ganglia. And then the other kind of movement disorder is hyperkinesia, in which movements are exaggerated. A typical example of that would be something called Huntington's chorea. And we will look at that when we get to dysarthrias. We'll look at how speech sounds with a dysarthric characteristic of a particular nature in Huntington's chorea and in other hyperkinesias. Okay, now we get to the limbic system. And the limbic system is a complex set of structures between the thalamus and the rest of the cerebrum. Phylogenetically, which means in terms of evolution of the species, it's an older part of the cerebrum. It's very old. If you want even to other structures that have a brain, but like a lizard, for example, they do have a limbic system, but they don't have much cortex. It includes parts of the telencephalon, cerebral hemispheres, as I said earlier, diencephalon and mesencephalon. And we're going to look at the parts in the next slide, but this shows sort of just, they've highlighted them in blue here, sort of oriented around the area we've been talking about with basal ganglia and thalamus, but actually part of the cerebrum. Here you can see this thing called the cingulate gyrus. It's part of the cerebrum, but it's way down at the core of the cerebrum. Okay, next thing shows the functions of the limbic system. Adrenaline flow, emotions, regulation of behaviors, motivation, long-term memory, and here we back to olfaction. Remember I said olfaction, information about smell does not feed into the thalamus, it feeds into the limbic system. And finally, I'll comment about the limbic system, and we won't be talking about the limbic system much in this course. It's regarded by some as a somewhat obsolete concept, in the sense that all those different parts don't necessarily function together in a unified way that's made clear by a singular concept. All right, these are the parts of the brain that are considered to be a part of the limbic system. The olfactory bulbs, shown here, that's out of actually the top of your nasal cavities. And it's the olfactory bulb is made up of neurons that receive information from little receptors in your nasal cavity that feed into that olfactory bulb. And then it gets carried back, not to the thalamus, which most sensory information does, but back to the limbic system. The hippocampus is part of it. You can see that it's actually part of the cerebrum. The amygdala, where is our amygdala? Am I missing it here? Oh, amygdaloid complex, it's labeled here. Anterior thalamic nuclei, fornix, mammillary bodies, septum pellucidum, habenular commissure, cingulate gyrus up here, parahippocampal gyrus, limbic cortex. Now, I'm not going to ask you to label those. I'm only going to ask you to know that those structures are part of the limbic system, to know that they're deep in the cerebrum, and to know the general functions that they're associated with. But other than that, we're really not going to deal with much in the course, although there's no way I could just go through this whole course and have you not have ever heard of the limbic system or know anything about it. Certainly, we're not going to dive deep into it. Okay. This is back to something I think we saw exactly this illustration before, or something very, very much like it. It shows the brainstem with the medulla, also called the myelencephalon, the pons, also called the mesencephalon, if you include with it the cerebellum. Here it is. The midbrain, also called the mesencephalon. I think I misspoke and called the pons the mesencephalon. I meant metencephalon. This is correct. And anyway, the brainstem contains ascending and descending tracts of neurons, carrying information up to the brain for sensation and feeling and processing of information, and down from the brain to cause you to move and cause glands to function and so forth. In addition to those tracts of neurons, it also does contain motor and sensory nuclei. And motor and sensory nuclei are collections of cell bodies that are involved in processing information. We'll look at quite a lot of detail at that as we go through the course. And there's also something at the core of the brainstem known as the reticular formation, which is associated with consciousness, the regulation of your sleep and wake cycles, with attention, and we'll look in a fair amount of detail at that. And also, as we look at the brainstem, we're going to look at the cerebellum, which attaches to the brainstem. There are 3 levels of attachment. We'll look at that later. And its function is coordination of movement. Somebody who has a lesion of the cerebellum will be discoordinated, and it can be quite severe to the point where you really can't walk. You can move, but not move in a coordinated way to accomplish meaningful movement. All right. Now, looking in the spinal cord in a little more detail, it contains ascending and descending pathways connecting the body to the brain. There is also gray matter within the spinal cord. And when we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord in a slide or two, you'll be able to see where that is located. And those are where cell bodies are located and where synapses are occurring. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves divided into the 5 spinal levels: 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Now, I want to show something about the relationship between the vertebrae, the column of vertebrae, which you're familiar with, the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal vertebrae, and the spinal cord. And you'll notice the spinal cord in an adult comes down not all the way. There is a canal here that it could go down in, but what happens, and if you look at an infant, it does come down all the way. But what happens is that the spinal vertebrae, the column of vertebrae, your backbone, grows more than does the neurological system. And as it grows, the tip of the spinal cord itself is found higher, higher, and higher. So if you look at an infant, it'd be down here, and a little later here, 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 and here's for an adult. That being said, I want to show let's look at 4 nerves. Excuse me for jumping. I didn't mean to jump. I guess I got so excited about this. Okay. There. Let's look up here at the first cervical spinal nerve. You'll notice that it leaves the cord and it comes out pretty much straight out to the side, and it goes through a little space and goes out to the muscles of the neck and the sensory areas of the neck to do the moving and the feeling of those particular muscles and sensory areas. If you go down to the first thoracic spinal nerve, you notice that before it gets out of the spinal column, it goes down just a little bit and then out. And then it goes to the muscles and the receptor areas. You go down to the first lumbar nerve, notice that it goes down three lumbar vertebrae and then exits. Now, the way that happened is that cord kept getting shorter and shorter and pulling those nerves up in the protective column that houses the cord. And here's the first sacral nerve, and it's all the way up here. Now, these are just little representative nerves, but keep in mind you have pairs of them, and you have, well, 31. There are 31 of those. And if you get down here, there'd be a whole bunch of them that come from the sacral level of the cord and even the lumbar area of the cord, well, sacral mostly, and then the one coccygeal nerve. And that it's a bundle of nerves, but the cord ends here. And that area is called the cauda equina, the tail of the horse. That's exactly what it means. It's sort of like a horse tail. Have you ever heard of a lumbar puncture? Sometimes the neurologist typically wants to test something about the fluid that houses that the cord and the brain are floating in. They're actually floating in fluid, and we'll study that in detail. And so from the back, they'll put a needle right through, usually the very lower lumbar area, into this area where they'll encounter fluid. The reason they put the needle in here, this area, and not up here, is because there's no danger of that needle hitting the spinal cord. It's going to go into the area of the cauda equina and sort of just find its little way. The needle will find its little way between the nerves that are hanging down like the hairs of a horsetail, and get the fluid without doing damage. If you did the puncture up here, the needle would puncture the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is a very small structure. It's about a little bigger than a pencil. I'm holding up a pencil, and I know it doesn't show very well. There we go. And it's got hundreds of thousands of neurons that it's carrying up and down. So the damage could be quite extensive just from a single needle puncturing it. All right, now this is a spinal cord, and it's a transverse section, also called a horizontal section. So we're cutting someplace along the way. Does it show? It doesn't exactly show, but this is fairly high in the spinal cord, and it gives us an opportunity to see where the tracks are that are carrying axons of neurons up or down. And it also gives us a place to show where the gray area of the spinal cord is located. And here it is. It showed green, but it's really gray. And the gray area consists of cell bodies, and there are connections. There are synaptic connections in there, and information is obviously, if you got a synaptic connection, for a reason, for some processing of some information. So we're just going to name some areas that you can see so we can use this language in the future. There are 3 funiculi. Funiculi are large areas of white matter. White matter being axons that have myelin, and they literally look, well, not exactly white, but light color. And those are carrying the funiculi have axons in them that are either going up to carry information up to the brain from the body, or down from the brain to the body, one or the other. And we know a lot about which direction they're going depending upon where it is you're looking. So first of all, we're just going to divide them into 3 areas. The dorsal, which means more toward the back, the dorsal funiculi, here's midline, so we have a right and a left dorsal funiculi, the lateral funiculi over here, and the ventral funiculi. They all are white matter, meaning axons going either up or down that are myelinated. Now, within those funiculi are tracks. Tracks are pathways of axons that are going to a particular area and carrying a particular kind of information, either up or down. And they carry names, of course, and we're going to learn some of them. Not in this slide, we're going to learn them as we go along later. But for right now, we want to be able to refer to dorsal, lateral, and ventral funiculi so you kind of know where we're talking about. And then realizing that each of those funiculi does contain tracts, which may have one will have a different function from the other. All right, another main landmark would be the dorsal gray matter. The spinal gray matter, and that's shown in green here, but that's the spinal gray matter. And again, the spinal gray matter contains cell bodies, and there are going to be synaptic connections and the processing of information. Right now, we just want to name them. On the dorsal side would be a dorsal horn. There is a ventral horn. And then if you go to T1 through T12, there is a lateral horn. Now, evidently, this is not a T1 through T12 transverse section because I don't see a lateral horn, but it's a little thing that just sticks out like that. All right, and we'll look at that in more detail. Although in our particular course, we're not going to look a whole lot at the functioning of the lateral horn, but we'll look a lot at the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. And then this also does show us the spinal nerves. It shows it more completely on our right-hand side. Here's a spinal nerve, and here's a ventral root. Okay, this is the ventral direction, dorsal direction. So each spinal nerve, each of the 31 pairs of spinal nerves has two roots, a ventral root and a dorsal root. And then they come together if you go out to the side a little bit or more distant from the spinal cord itself, they come together and form a single spinal nerve. So 31 pairs of spinal nerves, each with two roots, a ventral root and a dorsal root. Ventral roots are all motor. All the neurons are carrying information from the CNS out to an effector organ. Generally we're going to talk about only muscles in our course. And then all the dorsal roots carry only sensory information. I'll point out a little detail, there is a ganglion, which is a collection of cell bodies in the dorsal root of all of the spinal nerves. And we'll get into more detail on that, but do you remember there's such a thing as a unipolar neuron where there's a cell body, and all these sensory neurons are unipolar neurons, and their cell body is located right here. A collection of cell bodies in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, is known as a ganglion. A collection of cell bodies in the CNS is known as a nucleus. Not the same kind of nucleus that you find in a cell, but a collection of cell bodies. And now I'm going to repeat this many times. You'll notice I don't even have it on the slide because it's not the main point of the slide. The main point of the slide is the three funiculi and the three horns, two shown here. And then the distinction, then the dorsal root and the ventral root, the fact that the ventral root is motor and the dorsal root is sensory. All right, here's a reminder. It's basically the similar thing to what we just saw. Ventral root is motor, dorsal root is sensory. There's a dorsal root ganglion, here it is. And here we see our unipolar neuron. And here you see, it sort of illustrated how these unipolar neurons function. You go out to the periphery, and there are some sort of receptors, a hair receptor or a skin receptor that's gathering information about touch or movement and the nature of it, and carrying it back to the CNS so it can be processed. And here is the cell body that supports the life of that particular sensory neuron. But notice there's no illustration, schematic illustration of a synapse there. There's a synapse here, but not a synapse there. In other words, a cell body without a synapse. Usually when we look at neuronal cell bodies, there are dendrites and there are synapses, but not in this case. All right, and then we see the ventral root with a motor neuron. The cell body of the motor neuron is located in the ventral horn, which should kind of gel with the slide I just showed you. And you'll see it's motor, so it's going out through the ventral root out to a spinal nerve. When the two roots come together, that's the spinal nerve. And it's going to an effector organ, in this case, a muscle. And that's mostly what we're going to be studying. We're going to be studying sensory areas and muscular function, not so much the glands and stuff like that. It's not a course about digestion, for example. It's a course about speaking, language, cognition, and swallowing. All right, that completes that segment, and I'm going to stop the recording. And I'll start by stopping the share, and then I'll stop the recording, and then I'm going to start a new one that covers slides 14 through 26. And you'll see at the end of the whole thing, there is the set of 10 questions. I'll see you back whenever you choose to come back. Bye.